Hello again, and welcome to part one of this coffee break session for Mosaic with Chris Marston, Chief Executive of LawNet. This particular session covers all things management as far as law firms are concerned and the financial performance that Chris is experiencing within the LawNet network. We join the discussion at the stage where we're considering issues surrounding management in the pandemic.
I'm seeing far more evidence of firms using the pandemic to bring forward modernisation plans that they would have liked to have introduced sooner, but there were blockers in their business, often very senior equity owning blockers. And those people, those blockers, the objections from them have melted away. And indeed, some of them have become evangelists for change. It's been quite.
Chris, can I just come back to your the non-lawyer chief exec? What percentage have non-lawyer chief execs?
Oh, if I'm looking at our network, it's probably no more than 15%.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me because I've always, I suppose I've always thought that as soon as a non-lawyer chief exec needs to start taking the difficult decisions, and that will happen, and that will mean they've got to remove equity partners, the equity partners then tend to turn on the non-lawyer chief exec and they become the casualty instead.
Well, curiously, what I've seen in the past, you know, you have to remember I'm a recovering banker, and so I come at this from that angle as well. Curiously, what I've seen happen just as often is a non-lawyer brought in to lead the firm at a critical time. And when they've done all that difficult stuff, the equity partners say, we don't need you anymore. Things are uncomfortable, you can go.
Right.
Just in the related situation, Chris, how many of the LawNet members have got non-fee earning managing partners?
Plenty. I was going to go on to say non-lawyers is one thing, non-fee earners is another thing entirely. Non-fee earning lawyers leading firms, I'd say it's close to 50%.
It's always a brave decision for a fee earning partner to go into a managing role with no fee earning.
Does it tend to happen, Chris, that they sort of get there in stages? I know one or two LawNet firms where the managing partner is now, to all intents and purposes, not fee earning. They might do 5 or 10 grand a year, but they probably got there in 2 or 3 steps that they split the roles in 2 almost for a time, and then found that the management role was taking ever increasing proportion of the time, and so the fee earning went by the way.
That's probably quite natural, really, isn't it, that people would want to evolve into that change, as it were.
No, what you've described there was very much my journey. In the first year and a half, as managing partner, CEO at Essex Daniels, I used to say I spent 75% of my time fee earning and 75% of my time managing the firm.
Yeah.
And when it got to the stage that my clients were done before breakfast or after 6 p.m, that just happened naturally, and I realised where my priorities lay. And then the GFC came along and made my mind up. Yeah. And I think once you give up the fee earning altogether, I think you have to recognise you're on a one-way journey. Then again, we've all had partners or colleagues. If I can paraphrase Howard's last contribution, who think it's only admin. What are you actually doing?
Oh, that's right. Yes.
In actual
I did
fact,
stop myself when saying that. Yes.
I know. But once you've mastered the basics of management, which is just problem solving, it's something lawyers are all good at. You realise that what you've got to learn is leadership.
You know, it's all too common that when you mention the word management to lawyers and you want them to think leadership, they do indeed think administration. Mm-hmm. And they're a unique bunch because, you know, they're the only people I know who refer to classify people by reference to what they're not. So, you know, get members, I still get lawyers saying to me, so you run this network of law firms, but you're a non-lawyer, aren't you? I'm also a non-plumber, but nobody ever calls me that. You know,
I think one of the things that's always struck me is that there's a perception in the wider world that bigger is better, and the bigger law firms are obviously better managed than the smaller ones, and it clearly is not the case when you start to see some of the really good stuff that your members are up to, and some of the rather antiquated stuff that some of the more illustrious names are up to. I think that there's an awful lot of good stuff going on in your network.
well, checks in the post, Barry, but I mean, the strikes me is that the exchange of ideas and information and best practice in our group is never the bigger firms in the group saying to the smaller ones, you really ought to do this because, and them showing the way. All too often, I mean, sometimes it is, but all too often the smaller firms who have a much shorter journey time from idea to implementation are able to say to the larger firms, look at what we've done.
Whereas you look at what we're doing here now, we set this up in the space of doing these sessions. In the space of one afternoon, we said, let's do them. And we made it work straight away. Trying to do that in probably even many of your firms, Chris, they're going to have a meeting to discuss it and decide who are going to be the people who are going to be doing these sorts of interviews and who are the right people and what topics to discuss. Decision making in the small firm is always far better and usually far more effective.
I think we'd quite like some sort of overview about financial performance. Yeah. How are firms facing up to Q1 next year?
So it was clearly a big focus for us.
Yeah.
And the story I'm hearing is condensed thus. So most of the year ends in March and April. Mm. Most of them build like crazy in March and April. Mm. Most of them will show for the year ended either 31st March or 30th of April 2020, a stonking year. Mm. Hurrah.
Yep.
Except when January comes and you've got a tax bill to pay on it. Most of our firms were encouraged to go out and get a CBILS loan, even if they didn't feel they needed one.
Yeah.
No.
Almost without exception, they've done that. They're also advised to be very thoughtful and careful about what you use that for. Put the money to one side. Do not use borrowed money to finance losses. Have it in reserve. Mm. Almost to a man, they've done that. The cash flow position in most LawNet firms, as I'm speaking now, is strong.
Yep.
There is confidence because also they're now busy in a lot of areas. Private client work kept them pretty busy during the early bits of lockdown. Residential conveyancing has picked up since. If you're doing corporate work, it's been a bit tough because, you know, transactions have been delayed and what have you. But there's a feeling of confidence. But we do know that if you delayed your VAT, because the government said you could, you're going to have to pay that in January.
Yep.
We know that January is always a poor month or December's a poor month for billing, which gives cash flow pressures in January. That's been the case ever since I got involved in lending money to solicitors 20 years ago. So that's fully expected. And partners tax, well, you know, on a stonking year, you're going to have a stonking tax bill. Mm. So that's inevitable. And many of our firms will, I suspect, begin to consider using those loans that they've taken at round about that time. Some of our firms are telling us they expect challenges to come a bit further down the line than that also out as far as April next year. Mm. Nobody in our network is being complacent. I think they are almost all saying do you know, I might end up the year about 10% down, but it's not going to be the complete and utter horror show that I feared when we first started planning how we were going to deal with the pandemic.
I think we actually ought to give a little bit of credit to one part of the government, and that the furlough scheme in particular has done its job of bridging that horrible gap that there was in April and May when a lot of things seized up. And actually, the furlough receipts came in very quickly.
Yeah.
And so people were actually able to reduce their operating costs before their income fell. And so it got them into good shape. And I think that was what the furlough scheme was intended to do. And so to that extent, and with the recovery that we've had in residential conveyancing, I think it's been far less damaging than we all feared so far. But as
Well, that completes part 1 of this session with Chris Marston of LawNet. Watch out for part 2 on a laptop coming to you shortly.
We leave in some of the gags, but edit out the complete waffle.